Have you ever noticed this tiny pocket inside your jeans? Not the normal pocket. The tiny one tucked awkwardly inside the bigger pocket. Too small for your phone. Too shallow for your wallet. Basically useless for modern life. And yet, it's still there. Almost every pair of jeans has one. Cheap jeans, designer jeans, work jeans, even jeans made more than 100 years after the pocket was invented. Which raises a surprisingly interesting question. Why does this tiny pocket still exist? Because it turns out, this little piece of fabric has a much deeper story than most people realize. Welcome to Ordinary Things, Deep History, where simple, everyday things usually have surprisingly complicated histories behind them. Today, most people call it a coin pocket. Some people use it for coins, keys, earbuds, rings, guitar picks, tiny random objects you forget about until laundry day. But none of those were its original purpose. To understand why this tiny pocket exists, you have to go back to the 1800s, back when jeans weren't fashion. They were work equipment. In the late 19th century, America was expanding rapidly. Railroads stretched across the country. Mining towns were growing. Factories were booming. And millions of workers needed clothes that could survive hard labor. Cowboys, railroad workers, miners, farmers. These people weren't looking for style. They needed durability. Because regular pants at the time had a problem. They fell apart constantly. Pockets ripped, seams tore open. Fabric wore out quickly under physical work. Workers needed something stronger. And that's where Levi Strauss enters the story. In 1873, Levi Strauss partnered with a tailor named Jacob Davis. Davis had an idea. Reinforce work pants using metal rivets placed at stress points. It sounds simple now, but at the time, it changed everything. The reinforced pants lasted far longer than ordinary trousers, and those pants would eventually become what we now know as blue jeans. But hidden inside those early jeans was the tiny pocket, and originally it had a very specific purpose. Back then, wristwatches barely existed. If you wanted to know the time, you carried a pocket watch, usually attached to a small chain. And pocket watches weren't cheap. They were valuable, delicate objects, especially for working men. Imagine being a railroad worker or miner carrying an expensive watch loose inside a large pocket while climbing, lifting, or riding horseback all day. The watch could crack, scratch, or fall out completely. So jeans included a small reinforced pocket specifically designed to hold it safely. That tiny pocket was originally called a watch pocket. And suddenly, it makes a lot more sense. The placement mattered too. It sat high inside the larger pocket, helping keep the watch secure while workers moved around. The smaller size wasn't an accident. It was designed specifically to stop the watch from shifting too much. Even the rivets around it helped protect the pocket from tearing, which tells you something interesting. This wasn't just decoration. At the time, this tiny pocket was genuinely useful, and for decades it stayed that way. Pocket watches remained common throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. But eventually something changed. Wristwatches became popular, especially after World War I. Soldiers needed quicker, easier access to time during combat, so wristwatches started replacing pocket watches entirely. And once wristwatches became normal, the original purpose of the tiny pocket basically disappeared. But here's the interesting part. The pocket survived anyway, even after the thing it was designed for almost vanished from everyday life. Why? Because clothing design has a strange relationship with tradition. Once certain details become iconic, they often stay long after their practical purpose disappears. And jeans are full of those leftover details. The copper rivets, the stitching patterns, the heavy denim fabric. All of it comes from practical workwear history. Over time, those features stopped being purely functional. They became part of the identity of jeans themselves, and the tiny pocket became one of those features. Removing it would almost make jeans feel incomplete, even if most people barely use it anymore. Of course, people still found new uses for it. Coins became the obvious replacement. That's why many people now call it a coin pocket. But over time, people used it for all kinds of things. Lighters, matchboxes, tickets, USB drives, rings, earbuds, small tools. Some people even use it as a secret pocket for emergency cash. And weirdly enough, that adaptability is probably one reason it survived. The purpose changed. but the pocket kept finding ways to stay useful. And honestly, this happens more often than you'd think. A lot of modern objects still carry pieces of the past, things originally designed for worlds that no longer exist. Take the floppy disk save icon. Most people under a certain age have never even used a floppy disk, and yet the symbol survived. Or the shutter sound your phone camera makes. It exists because old cameras made mechanical clicking sounds. Even electric cars sometimes include fake engine noises because people are used to hearing them. Old ideas lingering inside modern design. The tiny jeans pocket is basically the clothing version of that, a leftover feature from another era that quietly survived into the modern world. And there's something strangely human about that. We don't redesign everything from scratch every generation. Sometimes we keep old details alive because they become familiar. They stop being practical and start becoming cultural. The tiny pocket isn't really about watches anymore. It's about history stitched into something people wear every day. And once you notice it, you start realizing how many ordinary objects quietly carry stories from the past. Things we stop questioning because they've always been there. But behind those tiny details are entire worlds. Old technologies, forgotten habits, jobs that disappeared, problems people once needed to solve. And somehow, those little pieces of history survive, even in your jeans. So the next time you put on a pair of jeans, take a look at that tiny pocket again. Because it isn't random. It's a leftover piece of the 1800s. A small reminder of railroad workers, miners, pocket watches, and the origins of blue jeans themselves. A feature designed for a world that no longer exists, still stitched into modern clothing more than a century later. This is Ordinary Things, Deep History, where the smallest everyday objects usually have the biggest stories behind them. Thanks for watching.